So moving from scoping into the execution phase, there are three things that came to light. The first one was around the focus on re-engineering, and by that we mean out in the field and in the back office, encouraging and monitoring and recording field adaptations to the installation process so that you can continuously improve the operating model and the processes for installation, reducing the cost of poor quality. And that learning will pay dividends during the full-scale rollout should you move towards it. But also in the back office, encouraging teams to think about how they would re-engineer the existing operating model to reflect the new capabilities and to assess what competency gaps are required. So, for example, where there are significant amounts of new information, what new capabilities are required in the asset management department to deal with the new information that's flowing. The other thing that's worth stressing in that part about the operating model is to think about the end rollout. Would this be a capability by capability release across the entire network, or would you take it circuit by circuit and make it completely smart? And there are a lot of questions in the operating model space that probably require more testing in pilot. The second critical aspect of the execution phase is the consumer interaction. And coming back to what I was talking about on the behavioral segmentation, it's really key to target specific messaging to different behavioral segments, but also to do that in a proactive basis at the citizen level within a city, but also kind of at a segmental level, so that you're targeting specific messages to specific audiences. But then to think about the channels for that engagement. So in some cases, peer-to-peer and kind of viral messaging is much more effective than other approaches, and getting peers to become champions of the process may be much more effective as a means of communication. And we've seen various different ways in which customers or companies are reacting to this requirement for more consumer interaction. The next point is about the field force and how you train the field force to manage that interaction. It may not be a level of interaction that field force engineers are used to, and that requires significant training. This may be the one and only time that a customer sees a physical face from the utility company. And if that first interaction is poor, that can affect the relationship between the consumer and the utility for an extended period of time. So it shouldn't be underestimated how important that is. Finally, briefly on the governance and PMO, you need to drive clear accountability through the multidisciplinary team. It's worth tracking the cost of poor quality within the process and really driving that strong PMO and design authority, and that will pay dividends in how smoothly the process runs and avoid finger pointing during when it becomes challenging, and it almost certainly will. I'll just skip over this slide. This is actually dealt with in much more detail in the paper and looks at how to deal with consumer behavioral segmentation and consumer interaction. So the next part of this is really looking at, once you've gone through the execution phase and are moving into kind of the ex-post analysis of the project, there are four things that have become quite clear. The first is that there is significant opportunity for knowledge exchange. Now, in some cases where fiscal stimulus is involved, it may be a requirement of the funding that knowledge exchange happens. So, for example, in the Low Carbon Network Fund in the UK, there's certainly a requirement for the people who are funded to do smart grid pilots to make the data publicly available for all the utilities on the basis that it's a shared cost across all the consumers in the UK. Now, the exchanging of those test parameters is important because you may deliberately choose to test exactly the same activities within a different environment to see whether there is an environmental change. But it may well be that there's enough data out there in order to identify what the outcome is that you're looking for and give you enough data to make the case. without having to test it yourself in the pilot, and therefore saving time and effort. But in order to do that, we need commonality on metrics. You need to have contextual data to allow for the normalization. So if you're comparing your project against one in Germany or elsewhere, then there's an opportunity to look at benchmarks. But also, there's a real opportunity to share lessons from the field, both internally within the company, getting field operatives to share their lessons and to improve the process as a consequence. But also, more broadly, to look at some of the challenges that have been found. So, for example, in some of the cases, the expectation of how quickly the communications infrastructure has been rolled out was not consistent with expectation, because when they got out into the field, they realized that the radio signal propagation was extremely poor. Now, that kind of information from a peer-to-peer field operative perspective will save an awful lot of time and effort, and we need to find better mechanisms for sharing that information, both within countries, between utility companies, and internationally. The second point is about simulation. There's a real opportunity to improve the level of simulation that we're doing, and therefore avoid the more cost in the pilots themselves. The more empirical data that's collected, the better the simulation will be. But not only that, when you transition into the rollout, you'll have much better information about how to structure and the development of the full-scale rollout on the basis of the lessons learned during the pilot stage. But you need to have that basis of empirical data. The second point there is about the contextual data again. If you're going to get the simulation right, you need to understand the conditions in which the experiment was taken, so that you can normalize that data. The third point is kind of a much more consumer-related point, and it relates to the behavioral segmentation. The pilot allows you to collect much more detailed and effective information on how consumers are actually reacting to different stimuli. And when it comes to developing retail strategies going forward, the more empirical data that you have on the way that consumers react to different product and service offerings, the better the company can develop targeted product and service offerings for each behavioral segment. And that requires a level of business model innovation during the scoping, but collecting strong data, and then working with people who are experts in how people make decisions within the home. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the way that people make rational decisions within the home is quite different to the way that they make decisions outside of the home. And an understanding of the behavioral economics is absolutely critical to changing the way that people consume and driving energy efficiency within the home. Different people react to different stimuli, and you need to create product and service bundles that are targeted at specific segments. And then finally, all of that data should go into a new wave of regulatory engagement. Regulators generally respond better to very rich data environments. If you've been collecting data through the scoping phase where you've identified what the changes that you would like to make with the regulator, then you'll have a really rich data set in order to go back and make a strong case for why you should have output-based incentives to encourage the delivery of those outputs. And certainly in the UK, what we're starting to see is a strong transition to output-based regulation, but driven by the fact that there is empirical data to show that by doing A, B, and C, you can deliver outputs that are deemed to be of societal benefit. And if you can make that clear empirical cause and effect relationship clear, then you're on much stronger ground for making the case for regulatory changes as you move into full-scale rollout. I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw to a close there in order to leave 10 minutes for Q&A. I'll be able to answer more questions offline as we go forward, but maybe if I can take a couple of questions from the group. The paper can be downloaded at this address. And if you have any specific questions, mine and Joanna's emails are on this final slide. Please feel free to drop me a line, and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible. But I'm more than happy to take any questions. So I'll take this in order and then look through the questions in more detail. But there's a question from Ruben Rojas, and is there a pilot or actual smart grid currently in existence which is viewed as the model for all pilots? If so, what makes the project stand out from all the others? Ruben, I think the answer to that is again, that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all policy. You see different pilots in different places with very different focus. And my advice to you would be, identify a utility company or a project that has a similar environment to yourself, both from a regulatory perspective and from a policy incentive perspective, but also in terms of the topology and kind of legacy position, because the type of test parameters that they'll be testing will be quite different. Now, some of them have been in more detail than others. I'm quite familiar, for example, with the Boulder case study, but we came across a whole series of other case studies that demonstrate different aspects of what's been done well. So, for example, in Germany, there's an excellent project that was done by Yellowstrom that looks at how to create more innovative business models around smart metering. And the way that they created the business model for consumer behavioral adaptation was quite innovative. And that would be an example I would use of how to create very consumer-centric pilots. There are some really interesting studies on consumer interaction, for example, where certain utilities have found that when they've been going into to the pilot rollout, that rather than that they've had very heavy spikes in customer call center calls, and they've had to deal with that through the process as consumers are trying to understand how to deal with their smart meter, and that created great insight into how to deal with engaging the consumers. So as I say, it's probably a horses for courses piece there. I'm just heading up. There was a question I was halfway through reading. So there's a question from Kent Zeller. How do you believe smart grid knowledge sharing will develop? Are there any smart grid best practice repositories in place today? But that's kind of a two-part question. I think certainly from an online perspective, what we'll see is a lot more community-based fora for how that happens. Now, clearly on the conference circuit at the moment, there's an awful lot of talk going around about smart grid pilots, and that is knowledge sharing in itself. But I certainly see online fora becoming more and more important. I think in multidisciplinary teams, the different vendors that are operating will be operating across so many pilots that they'll be very important in terms of disseminating the best practice. But also there's a much more structured approach. So, for example, I believe the DOE have created a repository for a lot of the test protocols on what's happening in different smart grid pilots, and they could be an excellent mine of information for data. I think one of the other things that we've been talking about for some time now is whether there's a broader opportunity for a clearinghouse for that data. I know that the DOE have responded to some comments that were made by us and others into the industry around that. But there may be an opportunity to do that at a more systematic level on a transnational basis. But somebody needs to be able to operate in that clearinghouse role. And obviously, that obviously again needs contextual data so that normalization and benchmarking can occur. But those are some examples of what I expect to see.